I feel like we need to have some nice background music for when we're starting here. It's very quiet, but I'm really happy to have you. Welcome to Wildlife Wednesday with the Calgary Migratory Species Response Team. I'm Kathleen Johnson. I'm one of the co-founders for CMSRT, and I'm joined here with some of our colleagues from the same group. And very happy to share Wildlife Wednesday with you. We started this as a learning event for our volunteers. And then when COVID hit, we had to learn how to go virtually. And we figured that a lot of these topics are of interest to a lot of people, not just to us. So we're excited to welcome you here. It's meant to be a relaxing, fun, laid back evening where we can listen to some really interesting speakers, ask questions, get to know one another, and just really just enjoy the time. So if you need anything at all, please make sure you send a little comment and feel free to unmute and ask questions throughout. We did ask Dan what his preference is, and he's just fine with having questions at any time. So you're welcome to raise your hand with the tool at the bottom in Zoom, or also just to unmute and let us know that you have a question. We'd be happy to have those during the meeting, and there'll be lots of time at the end as well. So before we go any further, I just want to say, in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, and the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, and the Anaxi Nakota nations. And Alberta is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. And we wish everyone well, all people who are making their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So we're very happy to have you here to meet Dan. And some of you probably already know Dan. Dan Arndt is a wildlife biologist, a beautiful photographer. I actually have one of his calendars here, and an avid birder. Dan was born and raised in the Calgary area. And he's actually been a volunteer with our organization right from the very beginning. Dan and a few other really fabulous people, I see that Bob is here as well, are they're part of our initial experts team that helped us to become established in the very beginning, along with Matt, who you met last week as well. So it's great to have Dan here. I've learned a ton from you, Dan, over the last couple of years. And so Dan is he's our resident bird identification expert on the team, along with Bob. I'm just so happy to have you here, Dan. I hope that you are just as excited as I am to share your knowledge.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathleen. That's a great introduction. So I guess I will take it from here.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much.
So today is going to be a little bit of a overview of bird identification, and really it's not meant to be completely exhaustive. It's meant to be kind of just a really basic overview of some of the trickier groups to identify. But before that, there's going to be a little bit of a talk about some of the basic bird biology or topography that really, once you learn some of these features and some of these things to look at, it makes identifying birds, when you're talking about what color of a bird or what pattern of a bird had, you can actually use these features to really narrow down what you're actually identifying. Because as we'll see, only a couple specific features, you can pretty much tell somebody what you saw. And if they know birds really well, they should be able to tell you almost immediately what it is. So as Kathleen said, I'm a wildlife biologist and a wildlife photographer, and I've volunteered with CMSRT since 2019. I've been working as a wildlife biologist for about 8 years and currently work for Stantec. I've worked for a few other consulting companies throughout the city, and have worked across Western Canada and traveled across Western Canada and the Western US pretty extensively. So I have seen a lot of different birds in different habitats and have photographed them pretty much wherever I've gone. So the outline for today, we're going to talk about the introduction, which we just went through, bird topography, which really comes down to the technical names. I'm not going to go into all the technical names because there's a whole lot more that I don't go over, but these are really the main things when someone's talking about describing the main features of a bird. This is what you're going to look at in these main features. We're going to go over three groups. Sparrows are going to be the main one. We're going to cover pretty extensively, most of the ones that we'll find here in the Calgary area. Warblers and flycatchers as well. They can be a bit challenging. With flycatchers, that'll be a longer discussion later on, but a lot of times just visually, it's very hard to identify them. But there's a couple around that you can probably make some educated guesses on. And warblers, in the spring, when they come up on their northern migration, they're in these really gorgeous, distinct plumages that make it really easy to tell what kind of bird it is you're looking at. It's really bright greens and bright oranges and reds. And sometimes those same birds on their way back south are black and white or slightly paler, or in some cases, there are birds that are completely black and white when they go north. And then when they turn around to go back south, they've molted all their breeding plumage and they look like four other species of warblers. So it can be very hard to tell them apart from everything else. And then the last point is going to be the photography tips for identification purposes. So with our volunteer organization with CMSRT, if you're just out photographing birds and you don't really know what you photographed, it's going to help you figure out if you have enough to send to somebody else to say, can you tell me what this is? And if not, then it might not even be worth sending it because sometimes you just don't have anything that's useful that's in view. And a lot of times it's just making sure you've got a couple key features. And if you've got a bird in hand when we're volunteering and doing our downtown walks, if you're trying to take photographs to identify, I think this is really going to help you figure out the main parts of the bird or the angles of a bird that you really want to focus on sending to whoever's doing the identification, whether it's myself, whether it's Kathleen, whether it's Anne, whether it's anybody else that's on the volunteer team.
Down. I was just curious before you go further, for any folks who are joining us who are not part of the Calgary Migratory Species Response Team, when you're talking about us going downtown and sending our photos in, do you mind just giving a really quick summary of what it is you're describing in case folks aren't aware of that?
Yeah. So when we are doing our walks downtown looking for window strikes, usually I've only been out in the fall, but I know we did a spring session this year. We're looking for birds that have hit a window and then succumbed to the injuries, and they basically died within close proximity to the window. But a lot of times we have a bird in really good condition, almost perfect condition a lot of times, that can be really tricky to tell exactly what it is. And we've had some examples in the past where we've had photos that are sent that look okay, but they don't tell you anything about the bird. You see a shot of just the belly, and that can be a couple different species, but it's the only shot the person went out and got and was able to get before they collected the bird, and then it went off to the freezer, and it can be identified easier at that point. But sometimes they degrade over time. Sometimes they're just not in the best shape physically. So when you take them out of the freezer, or you freeze them and thaw them, they just start to not really be in the best condition after a little while. So usually when we have folks that are out doing the window strike searches, we have somebody on hand that you just send a text message and say, hey, I don't really think I know what this is. Can you help me out? And for the most part, even if it's a text to me at 6 o'clock or 6:30 in the morning, I'm usually going to be up. I'm often going to be out at work already. But if I've got cell service and it's an easy, quick ID, then it's really easy for me to say, I think this is this, or can you just maybe snap a couple other pictures from these different angles? And it really helps us narrow down what birds are hitting, what time of year they're hitting, and really what buildings. It's not really necessary to know that for my purposes for identifying what these birds are going to be, but it does help us out a little bit. If we know there's areas where, say, we've had a bunch of white-throated sparrows in the garden area, and then all of a sudden you've got a bird at that building, well, it might be one of the white-throated sparrows we've been seeing for the last 2 weeks. So when you're looking at a bird, there's, again, these are the really technical terms: bill, throat, crown, breast, flanks, belly. All of these birds. So this is a white-throated sparrow. It's a juvenile white-throated sparrow, and I picked this one because it's one that threw me off even earlier this year. Kathleen had sent me a photo saying, "I'm not sure what this is." And my first thought was not this species. It was actually something else that would have been a lot more rare. But looking at a few of the things about it, you can tell that it's got an orange bill. It's got kind of a grayish supercilium, which is the line that goes above the eye, behind the bill, but below the crown. It's got a reddish crown, a grayish throat. The throat, breast, and belly color is pretty much all the same. But then the flanks are kind of that tan color that's similar to the rump or the back feathers. The nape can also be a key identifying feature for some species. It's basically just the back of the neck, below the crown, and below the eye line here. The rump, there's a couple species that will really be a key indicator for. So with warblers, there's a few species that is a specific color, and that'll tell you exactly what it is, the yellow rump warbler being a good example. The tail, it's pretty obvious. It's a really technical term though, so I know it's might be a bit challenging. And then you've got the undertail coverts. So basically, coverts are a type of feather tract that covers over an area under or on top of something else. It's really just more protection. It doesn't really provide a lot aside from insulation or protection of the feathers that it's protecting. So these are protecting the undertail here. So that's kind of their purpose there. Crown can be really important for a lot of species. So white crowned sparrow. This is a juvenile, so it's not going to have that white crown, but we'll see some photos later on that can be useful for as well. Golden crowned sparrow is another good example where that's a key feature. And then there's some warbler species that it becomes really important as well. So depending on the species, depending on the group, you're going to focus on describing all of these features. So if you were to describe this bird, you would say, as I said before, the throat, breast, and belly are kind of the same grayish color. The flanks, the rump, the back, they're all kind of tan. The nape is a dark gray, supercilium is gray. The bill is orange. So that's kind of the only thing about this bird. And it's got a reddish brown crown. But the bill just kind of stands out as being the one thing that's sort of unique for this bird, aside from everything. But when you take it all into consideration, just describing even just the head of this bird can really narrow down what you're looking at to someone who's an expert. So now we'll get into the head topography. So these are some more technical terms that really help you, again, narrow down and describe a bird. So if you were to say that this bird has yellow lores, which are these feathers in front of the eye, it has a median crown stripe that's white, 2 black lateral crown stripes, a black eye line. Auriculars on this guy don't really stand out. They're kind of grayish, and a white malar stripe, which you can't really see it, but there's actually another feather tract that runs right here that is a pre-malar stripe that actually distinguishes between the malar on this guy and then the throat patch. So this guy has a white throat as well. So all of that together, the white throat just by itself, someone could tell you that this was a white-throated sparrow that you're looking at. But then if you didn't have that, if you only had part of the head, for instance, you might say that it had those yellow lores and a white supercilium. So that in and of itself is good enough to say that's a white-throated sparrow. And then the wing topography. So this is, for a lot of birds, especially when you're describing them, this isn't going to be super important, but there are some features that you're going to look for that can help you narrow down some things. A lot of times it's in the flycatchers, but this is really important and good information just to have if you're talking about these specific types of feathers. So the primary flight feathers, they're essentially what's going to be providing most of the lift and the thrust when the bird is flying. The secondaries are really more used in gliding or sustaining that flight. And then the tertials, these are the ones that are closest to the body. They're used a little bit more for balance, but they can be used for braking, for steering. And each of them is independently controlled by a muscle that attaches right underneath that wing. You've got your primary coverts. So they're the ones that are protecting the bases of the primary flight feathers. Then you've got your greater secondary coverts right here, which are covering the bases of your secondary flight feathers. Your median secondary coverts, which are actually covering your greater secondary coverts. And then your scapulars, which essentially are just the shoulder feathers. They're just covering over everything else. There's something that you're going to see whether the bird is perched or whether the bird is flying. And then last point here is the alula, which is essentially the thumb. There's 3 big feathers there. That's used for steering, for braking, and for sort of rapid changes of direction while the bird is flying. But if you were to describe a robin, all of these feathers are essentially the same color. There's nothing really distinctive or diagnostic about anything. They all sort of blend into each other. If you were looking at this bird and trying to figure out how old it was, it's a little bit more of a technical thing, but you could tell that the alula actually looks really fresh. It's nice and sharp. Whereas these primary coverts, they're a little bit fluffy, a little bit worn, a little bit fringy. And then these median coverts here are a little bit worn as well. So whatever's happened, all of those features, if you're getting into more advanced identification, this can tell you how old this bird actually is. I actually don't know off the top of my head based on those features, but I do know that this is a male because he has the black head versus a gray head. And he's probably an adult because I took this in March a few years ago, and he's mostly into his breeding plumage by the time they get back up here. So at the very least, he was born a year ago, but he could be 10 years old.
Sorry,
We
Dan,
really don't know.
What is it that you said could help you age the bird?
So the amount of wear. So if you look at these primary flight feathers, they're really sharply edged. They're really well defined at all of those edges. Same with these secondaries. They're really nicely. There's no wear. There's no fluffiness at the edges. It doesn't look like it's tattered at all. But if you look at this guy right here, it looks really tattered. These ones in here too, and then these primary coverts as well. So that tells you that those haven't been replaced recently, and they are just retained from the last time the bird molted. Whereas these ones, the bird probably molted before it started migrating north. So they might be weeks old. So they won't be worn at all. When you look at tail feathers actually for a lot of birds are a lot more of an indicator of how long those feathers have been worn down, because if you've got a bird that's mostly spending a lot of time on the ground, like robins in the spring, for instance, they're going for ants and grubs and stuff under leaf litter, those tail feathers will get worn down really quick. So if they're brand new and fresh, you know that bird molted maybe days ago, potentially.
Wow. I feel like we could have a whole
class. But there are Oh, absolutely. There are some great books out there that tell you about bird molts, and in fact, it's entirely what you use for aging and identifying the sex of birds when you have them in the hand when you're banding them. It's entirely about feather wear and which feathers are retained, because different species replace different groups of these feathers at different times. So it's not even just all thrushes will molt in the same pattern. No, sometimes a robin will molt a different group of feathers at a different time than like a hermit or a Swainson's thrush will. And there's a gigantic book. Peter Pyle has a book on bird banding, and it's a tome, and there's 2 giant books on it that each species has like 5 or 6 pages on that molt pattern. So I've got some good examples here of some birds that can be really hard to tell apart. So on the left, we've got our flycatchers. I'm going to go over each of these in each individual slide. We'll talk about why this is what it is. And, these guys mostly look the same. These 2 can be hard to tell apart sometimes as well. Flycatchers, again, I mean, these 2 look almost identical, but they're actually 2 different species. So it's It's a tough thing. These two warblers are taken in the fall, so they will look quite similar as well. And then the sparrows, they don't really change their plumage. So in the spring, it's going to be exactly the same as it would be in the fall. The only tricky part with those guys is that the juveniles will have a completely different look to them. Flycatchers, unless you hear them sing, for the most part, you're not going to be able to identify them most of the time. Especially in this part of the world. There are other parts of the world where the flycatchers can be much, much easier. But if you were to go to Europe, for instance, the flycatchers there are almost impossible to identify. Um, they're almost impossible to identify, even if you do hear them singing. It's a like a super expert skill. I see you have some questions in the chat here. So
Well,
the beaks of local birds.
I was just commenting. I did not know until you explained it that we could tell the difference between male and female robins. I know that some species
Yes.
you can and some you can't. And I always thought robins were in the group where you couldn't tell the difference. So I will never look at a robin the same way again. So thank you for that education. And I did really like
Yeah. So I'll just go back to that.
Yeah, and the question on the bill, I think, was a really great question.
Yeah. So this robin, yeah, because he has a black head, it's going to be a male. Um, there is also some indication with the amount of white in the tail feathers, but that can be a bit tricky and it might not be entirely reliable. But the black head, that's going to tell you that this bird is a male. If it was a female, the gray would be kind of more this gray color that you see on the back of the bird. It's going to mostly blend together. It's going to be the same with juncos actually too. A female junco will have that mostly. Um, the head color will be the same as the back, for instance, in that species as well. And that's super reliable once you're into the spring. Now in the fall, because the default for most birds, they're in plumage wise for the juveniles, their default is sort of a female type plumage after they come out of the nest. It could still be a male, but you're not going to know until it goes south, molts entirely, and comes back north in the spring.
Because it's just the youngster hasn't grown into their adult colors.
Yes.
Okay. And
that's
the
right.
plumage that you see in the fall, even with the adults, is different than the spring as well. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Okay. That's exactly right. Yeah. Depending on the species. So for instance, ducks. I don't really talk about ducks in this because that's probably an hour-long discussion there for non-passerine birds. But ducks, gulls, shorebirds, they in the fall they can be almost impossible to tell apart. For male mallards, for instance, the only real way you can tell the difference between a male and a female is if the male has molted its tail feathers and it has that little curly bit on the tail. But otherwise, they look identical to females until they get back into their breeding plumage again.
Oh, I see.
So the question about the beaks of the local birds changing color as they get older, not so much in passerines. So sparrows, warblers, flycatchers, kinglets, chickadees, things like that. Some of them do, and I'll talk about that in a minute here too, with individual species. But for the most part, bill changes in bill color can be an indication of age in gulls. So most gulls, when they're born, will have a black bill, but things like ring-billed gull and California gull, by the time they're adults, they'll have a yellow bill with various different colored spots or rings on their bill, but that can take up to 4 years for them to get to that adult plumage. Shorebirds can have a different color bill in the spring because they actually get there's an increase in the amount of capillaries that go into the sides of the bill. So some species will have red, like a really bright red at the base of the bill, but by the time they get into the fall, that'll just turn back to black again. It's really subtle, and you have to get a really good, really, really close look at it to tell that difference. But some species you can tell if you just get a look at the bill, you can say, okay, this is an adult of this species because it has that red in the bill.
Wow. There's so much to know. This is awesome. Let's see. We have a thumbs up there. Thank you. And Bob answered one of the questions here, which is great. Thank you, Bob. Maybe you can expand on this too. Laura had asked if male robins have a darker breast, or is it just the head? And then Bob was explaining that they do have a darker breast, especially in the breeding season. See, I didn't know that either. There's so much to
Yeah,
know. Hey, it's
that's
so interesting.
absolutely, absolutely.
Wow.
So here's 4 species. There's a few unifying features of with the sparrows. I tried to lump them all together by things that either you could mistake for each other, or they're in the same family or group, or they're just, for whatever reason, they're challenging in their own right. So with the white crowned sparrow, as we talked about earlier, this is a juvenile. So he's got that orange bill. He's got a little bit of coloring around the eye. He's got a nice eye line. Buffy on the flanks, grayish on the breast and belly, grayish in the throat. Nothing really makes this guy stand out from anything else. Brewer sparrow beside it has a dark bill on top and pink on the bottom. That can be enough to tell it apart from a clay colored sparrow, which has an orange bill. But some of it too is habitat wise, like what you're finding them in. But again, if we're finding these birds, let's say we're finding these birds downtown on migration as they're moving through, habitat gives us no context. So those context clues of habitat can be super important when you're identifying birds in the field that are alive. Some of these species will be abundant in a lot of different habitats, but white-crowned sparrows are mostly in the foothills and the mountains. Brewer sparrows are either in the high alpine or on the prairies. Clay-colored sparrows are going to be just about anywhere. You can get them all the way up to tree line, but you also get them out on the prairies. So they're everywhere. And the chipping sparrows are mostly in forested areas, so coniferous or deciduous forests, really dense, dark, old growth or second growth forests. But on migration, they also show up literally everywhere.
So
But
can I
these 3 guys.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask Dan while you're speaking about that. I'm curious. I never knew the existence of any of these until I was working with all of you with the window strikes and the folks who are watching. I'd be curious if you pop into the chat just a number out of the 4 species on the screen here. How many have you heard of before today? I would just be really curious, and don't be embarrassed because I was 0 not long ago, and in fact it was a chicken sparrow I think that Bob identified for me via Twitter long ago. But sorry, continue on, Dan. Sorry for interrupting you there.
Okay. So one of the things that ties these 4 species together is that they really don't have a lot of color on the belly or on the flanks, or if they do, they're all pretty distinct. Like they're pretty similar. So they've got gray in the throat, the belly, a little bit of that brown in the flanks. So if that's all you were using to describe these birds, it'd be really tough. It'd be really, really tough. But if you look at this guy, comparing the white crowned sparrow to the clay colored sparrow, this clay colored sparrow has a lot of color in the head. He's got a couple little stripes along the top. He's got a nice dark brown crown, light brown or tan in the face around the eyes, that brown supercilium. But this guy also has a brown supercilium. This guy also has a dark brown eyeline. So what else does this guy have? Well, he's got a white malar stripe. So mustache stripe is an easier term for it. And this guy doesn't. And this guy kind of does, but he's okay. How would you tell these 2 apart? And this guy just has much more bold colors, and that's really another nice feature. And he's also got some really creamy colored wing bars. Wing bars can be a really important thing, but if you look at pretty much all of these guys, they've got wing bars of some sort to an extent. And those wing bars essentially are just the very tips of the median coverts or the secondary coverts that are covering up the primaries. So this guy has 1 wing bar. This guy has a really faint wing bar. This guy has 2 wing bars. Doesn't really help with these guys to narrow that down either. So last thing is the nape color. Well, this guy here, of these 3 on the top, has a really distinguished gray nape. So that'll tell you, that's actually a really good identifying feature for clay-colored sparrow, even if you don't have any part of the head. If you just have the head and below, or the neck and below, that gray nape can be enough to identify it as a clay-colored sparrow based on all these other features. Because this guy's nape is exactly the same as his back. Same with this guy. Nothing really, no clean break in colors. Chipping sparrows, on the other hand, they've got a bright red crown. And so if you were looking at a bird that kind of looked like one of these four, but he's got that bright red crown, really heavy gray in the face, but not much else except an eye line, that could be a nice feature to tell you it's a chipping sparrow. And then in the spring, these guys, again, they look really gorgeous like this, nice bold colors. And that does fade into the fall, so that it can be a challenge. And then you get juvenile birds, which we'll talk about in a second here. Any questions about these guys? All right, I'm going to move on. So now we've got four more birds that all look pretty similar. They all, in fact, are all pretty much in similar habitats. So it can be, habitat doesn't really tell you too much about what these guys are doing. But let's start with the Lincoln sparrow. So for me, the thing about the Lincoln sparrow that sort of stands out is really streaky on the flanks, white or cream colored belly, and that nice cream colored mailer stripe there. But fox sparrow doesn't have that at all, so you can rule that guy out. Song sparrow kind of has that mailer stripe, but it's really bright white in the belly and in the breast, and it will also have a really bold central breast spot. Whereas this guy doesn't have that. He just has really, really fine streaks. But this is another one that has a lot of gray in the face and a lot of gray in the nape. Whereas the song sparrow doesn't really have that. Again, it's that tan or brown color that just continues on from the top of the head all the way down the back. The fox sparrows, this is the subspecies that we have in the mountains. So this picture was taken at Highwood Pass. There is another subspecies on the west coast that's a lot more darker. It's almost black. It's actually really distinctly marked bird. So it's not something we're going to see here in Calgary. But then you've also got your chipping sparrow, and he has those really fine streaks, again, almost like the Lincoln sparrow. So these two guys here, they do look very similar because he also has a little bit of gray in the nape too, right? Which, if we go back, the adult chipping sparrow also has that. So what can you do to tell this guy apart from this guy? Well, there's not much gray in the face. Again, it's more that tan or brown color. If you look really carefully, you can see on the top of this guy's head, he has a red crown stripe, median crown stripe, and then a gray central crown stripe. And then on the other side, there's going to be that reddish brown median crown stripe again. So that's a nice feature. This guy doesn't really have that. It's kind of all mussed up, same sort of color pattern in the crown there. But then if you also look, the bill color is a little bit different too. Lincoln sparrow is going to be a grayer bill, and this is kind of a yellowish gray. There is a distinct color difference in the bill colors as well that can really help you make that distinction as well. As I was saying before, habitat wise, these guys there's not really much distinction. Song sparrows are usually by rivers and streams. Lincoln sparrows are usually by wetlands, but can also be found by rivers and streams. Fox sparrows, they're going to be high elevation, but you can still get wetlands at higher elevations, and you can still get rivers and streams at higher elevations. So all three of these guys might be identifiable in the same 100-meter stretch along, let's say, Highwood Pass, which is again where this guy was seen. Chipping sparrows even up there as well in the summer. So that's the habitat for these guys doesn't tell you a whole lot of information. This guy here has a gray head, kind of makes him stand out. And if you look at the patterning or the shape of these little streaks on him, they're all kind of arrowhead shaped or chevron shaped. And if you have that feature, this is just a straight stripe. These are all little straight lines, pinstripes. Those chevron shaped breast or flank stripes, that's another nice key feature for fox sparrows. And these are all in the same genus. So they all have a very similar body shape. They all have relatively similar behaviors. They're all seen in Alberta pretty regularly. The Harris's sparrow is probably the one that isn't seen here as often, but It's a regular bird in the spring and fall. It doesn't breed here, but the other three, they do breed in Alberta. So if you were to describe this guy, we talked about the white-throated sparrow. It's that yellow, that nice bright yellow lore, the white, bright white in the throat. That's going to tell you exactly what this guy is. The golden crown sparrow, that key feature of him is pretty much diagnostic. He's got a nice bright yellow patch on the forehead. That's the only thing that has that, even amongst other groups of species, so warblers, other flycatchers, and things like that. They all past the head. This is one of those really important parts where if you get a good look at the head of the bird, that's going to tell you all you need to know. Because past the head, these all the white-throated, the white crown, and golden crown, they all are identical. There's not much patterning on the breast on these guys. Same with the white crown sparrow. Again, it's got a nice clean breast and belly color. The Harris's sparrow, on the other hand, does have some black color in the breast and in the throat. It's got a little bit of a whitish gray throat. This isn't in full breeding plumage. This is in the fall as well. So it's not the most diagnostic look, but it's the one we see most commonly here in Alberta.
We
I
had
don't.
a question too about, oh, I'm sorry, about house sparrows. And house sparrows are introduced,
Yes.
but I think they're spread right across North America. And for, I guess, lots of folks, that'll be the first bird that they're able to identify out the window. And so I'm not sure if you've got any sort of comparative tips or anything with the house sparrow to help people, especially for any of us who are beginner at identifying, with respect to the house sparrow, because I think one of the first ones that you had there too, the juvenile white-throated, almost could have been confused with a female house sparrow. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, in fact, as I was going through my photos to get photos for the presentation, one of my older photos that I had identified as a juvenile white crown sparrow was actually a female house sparrow. So I corrected that and made some notes on that. But I think one of the things about the house sparrows is it's because it's going to be one of the most common birds, especially if you have bird feeders out, or if you're spending a lot of time in more urban areas that aren't green spaces. They're going to be the one that's ubiquitous. It's going to be everywhere. And I guess the easiest thing for me when I was learning sparrows the first time was figuring out which ones look and sound different than all the house sparrows. Because you very quickly, because again, when they show up at your feeders, there's usually a lot of them. You can tell the males because they've got that really black bib. I don't actually have a slide for them, but let me just pull up a photo here and I'll share that really quickly here.
Oh, thank you, John, for doing that. That's awesome.
One of the key things is again, like figuring out, all your house sparrows, you know what they look like, you know what they sound like, and then you need to figure out what looks different underneath your bird feeder or outside your window, or what sounds or definitely sounds different. That is one thing I haven't really emphasized here is the importance of identifying birds by sound, but
right. And their behavior too sometimes, I think, like the other day, just while you're looking for your photo there, the other day we get quite a few nuthatches, which I adore, but I noticed something was just a little bit different, and it just caught my eye when I took a look. It was actually, I'm like, I think that might be a brown creeper. I was really excited, but then by the time I kind of got my eyes focused on it, it was gone. And then the other day I was outside, and sure enough, a brown creeper showed up. So I think too, the more you observe and see the behavior, would you say that's fair too? That something is behaving a little bit differently, like if you see house sparrows in the shrub, but then now you see two of them poking around in the leaves underneath, might be indicating might be a little bit different.
Absolutely.
Species.
Is my house sparrow photo sharing? Doesn't look like it is.
Yes.
Okay.
It sure is. That's a neat picture, actually.
So this is a male. It was taken in the fall, on October 20th, 2013. So you can see that black bib and the sort of creamy colored collar. They look very different from any of our other birds. They have a really bright yellow bill as well. So they don't really look like anything we have here that's native to North America. Um,
Hmm.
when they fully come into their adult plumage, the males especially, the whole front of the face turns black like this. So yeah, this guy's just coming into his adult plumage. I think it was a juvenile, probably born that summer.
That is a really nice photo. You should look into becoming a photographer, Dan. You're really good.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take that in mind.
You should when you're in your spare time.
Yeah,
Thank you for sharing that.
no
And we
problem.
also have another, yes, that was a house sparrow. That's right. That was a male house sparrow,
That's correct.
white-tailed,
Yeah,
and then the
yeah,
female would not have the black.
that's right. That's right. So if
And then
you
we have
compare
a,
that though
yeah,
to
sorry,
the
go ahead.
the Harris's sparrow, it kind of does have a sort of similar look, but this is one of those things where you can say it kind of looked like a house sparrow, but it had a pink bill. Maybe it was a little bit chunkier, maybe had some bolder wing bars or something like that, but it was just acting differently. It would sound different to a house sparrow. But and if you were to see them both sort of interacting or behaving underneath your feeders or outside, the behavior would be completely different. Whereas the house sparrows are really aggressive and they kind of go after the food and fight amongst each other. Harris's sparrows do tend to be pretty reclusive and sort of shy. They might come out and forage around a little bit, but if something was to come after them and try to chase them off, they wouldn't fight. They just fly off and go do something else for a little bit until they thought it was safe to come back out.
Wow, that is
So with all
awesome.
of
I just want
these,
to let,
what,
yeah, I
go
was just
ahead.
going to say, let everybody know that any questions from beginner to expert are absolutely welcome. And so we have a slightly more complex question coming your way, and just let me know when you're ready for it.
Go right ahead.
You ready? Okay. Do you need water or anything? Or are you good?
I'm good.
So, um, so could you talk please about the tan and black versus the white and black variations in, and this very kind person is testing my knowledge of the 4-digit coding, white-crowned sparrows and the white-throated sparrows. And maybe for those of us who aren't as familiar about even what a variation is, could you give us like a little basic about what's a variation? What do you mean a variation? And then for this wonderful person is more of an expert birder, so a little bit more detail to you on the variation between the tan and black and the white and black variations.
Yeah. So I'm going to pull up a tan white-throated sparrow here on my other screen, and I'll share that here again.
Awesome. Thank you.
So this is our tan white-throated sparrow. So instead of having that white supercilium, it's tan colored. The yellow in the lower is a little bit more diffuse. And then that crown stripe, the central crown stripe ends up being tan as well. But everything else, and then I guess the median crown stripes are more brown than black. So essentially you have two populations or two variations, I guess, within the white-throated sparrow that are genetically linked, that have a lot of impact on their behavior in their parenting behavior. So the tan and brown, or the tan striped, we'll just call them tan striped and white striped, white-throated sparrows. The tan striped are not super aggressive, but they have really good parental. They spend a lot more time you doing parental care, so keeping the nest taken care of, singing on territory to keep other adults or other males away from the territory. They feed their babies a lot more. They tend to stick around and will defend a nest from a predator or something like that a lot more strongly. However, they're not the most robust. They're not the most effective at defending that territory. They're not really the strongest. But they also typically will only have one single mate per season. Whereas the white striped, which I will switch back over to now, are white striped. These guys here are really loud. They're really super hyper aggressive, but they're bad parents. They don't really take care of the babies all that well. They don't really spend a lot of time around the nest defending it, but they're very strong at fighting off other white-throated sparrows from a territory. So they're very good at defending between different species, or sorry, within their own species from their mate being bred with by another male. So they will usually outfight a tan-striped white-throated sparrow for a territory or for a mate, but they won't take care of the babies. So typically what you have happening in many cases is you have one one white-striped breeding with one tan-striped in most situations. So that you have one that's really, really good at defending the territory and one that's really good at taking care of the babies. You do have some rare instances where you have two white-striped white-throated sparrows. That's not super common because they just sort of defend the territory, but they don't take care of the babies very well. So they don't have a lot of nesting success because they're not feeding the babies enough for more than one or two to actually survive. When you have two tan-striped white-throated sparrows that are breeding, what you end up having is that they're very good at feeding their babies and taking care of the young and having lots of eggs too. Laying lots of eggs is another big thing. But if another white-throated sparrow comes in and contests the territory, they're not very good at fighting them off. So they just will lose that nest. They'll abandon the nest as a last-ditch effort because they have this really big, strong, powerful white-striped white-throated sparrow that's decided that where they were nesting, well, that's his home now, and they'll be forced out. There's a lot of discussion about essentially this species having four genders. I don't think that's really giving it the proper terminology. They're really just four different lifestyle habits that is influenced by genetics in these birds. Other species, we might have these very similar habits, but they're not as visually linked to their plumage. So there might be chickadees that do the same thing, but they all look like chickadees. It could be the same in robins. There could be robins that are very strong defenders, but bad parents, or very good parents, but weak defenders. With the white-throated sparrow, though, because it's so visually obvious, it makes it a really good study species for this sort of interactions. And they do actually have very specific chromosomes that will determine those features, whereas in a lot of other species, they don't really have that quite as hard-coded into their DNA. There's a bunch of papers that have been put out probably in the last 15 years about white-throated sparrows kind of related to this. So if it is something that is interesting to you, I mean, it really is just a generally interesting topic. I think Cornell has put out a few blog posts about it, and you probably spend days just digging into what's publicly available for the layperson to read and understand what's going on with this species.
Thank you, Dan. That was, wow, so interesting.
So we'll finish up with this group of sparrows. So all of these guys, as I was saying, the Harris's sparrow, they breed in the far north. They'll come through in the spring and in the fall. Sometimes they'll spend the whole winter in southern Alberta. But again, they're kind of shy, kind of reclusive. They're sort of the smallest in this genus of sparrows, and really stands out just for its distinctiveness. Whereas the white crowns, again, you're going to describe it by that white central crown stripe, the black median crown stripes, the jet black eye line, and then gray supercilium, gray malar, gray cheek patch, gray nape. This guy doesn't have quite as strong of anything. He just has those black median crown stripes and the golden patch on the crown. There's actually this part of the crown, the front part of the crown, is called the poll. So if you have heard of common red polls, it's that patch on the front of the forehead that is describing that color for red polls. It's a red patch on the head. So you could also call it, a red crowned finch if you wanted to be specific and more layperson-y, but the actual species name in those cases is the common redpoll. So now we've got some other species that again look sort of similar. So they've got not a lot going on in the breast. So that you've got a savanna sparrow here on the left. So it's got a little tiny breast spot there, and then streaky on the flanks, white belly, streaky on the flanks for the Vesper sparrow, white belly, streaky on the flanks here. But he's got a little bit of that golden color or yellow colored breast. And the same with the LeConte sparrow, golden colored, but white belly, white breast, and a little bit of streaking. So these guys are all sort of tied into similar habitats too. Nelson's and LeConte sparrow are sort of wetland species, but Vespers and Savannas are out on the prairies. And you often will hear these guys too out on the prairies as well in the right sort of habitat, wetter habitats. So if you're going to describe what stands out specifically about a Savanna sparrow, the one or two things, you're going to look at this yellow supercilium, yellow lores, but no white throat, smaller bill. It's a much smaller looking bird overall. No white supercilium attached to it. It's kind of that yellowish, streaky supercilium color. And then the Vesper sparrow, what stands out about that guy? Well, they always have this red patch in this particular section of the wings. And I did talk about this section of the wings before and drew some attention to it. So in the robin, it was one of those ones that I said, it kind of just looks like everything else. There are a couple species of sparrows and then some longspur species as well in the prairies that have the scapulars a very distinct color. Nelson sparrow. Nelson's and LeConte sparrows, I think, are our most colorful and prettiest looking sparrows that we have. The really unfortunate part about them is that you almost never see them because they're so secretive. They, both of them really, if they're acting defensive or you get too close to their nest or they're defending their territory, they'll run across the ground through the foliage and then they'll pop up for a second and chatter at you, and then they pop down into the ground into the vegetation and they run away again. So they're really, really, really secretive birds. And you can actually tell, like I was saying before about those tail feathers. This guy, his tail feathers are just almost non-existent. They're just those central vein of the feather is all that's left of this guy. So beak or bill, they're interchangeable. You could call it either. In fact, both of the examples I used to kind of describe or to pull the names of the different parts of the topography, the two diagrams I used, one used beak, one used bill. If you wanted to get really technical, you would call it the upper and lower mandible. But if you say beak or bill, anyone's going to know what you're talking about in general. There's I guess there aren't any purists out there that won't listen to you if you say it's one or the other. These two guys, the Nelsons and LeContes, they can be mistaken for each other quite a bit because they do have a lot in common. I would just say that one of the big things, again, you have that central crown stripe. With this guy, it's going to be that dark slate gray. And this guy, it's actually white. This photo doesn't show it off very well. I don't actually have any photos that show it off very well. But then he's also got a gray cheek patch as well, right? So this guy's more brownish in the cheek. And then with the Nelson sparrow, if you were to zoom in really close or get a really good close look at this bird, those are actually purple flecks in the feathers on the nape. And this guy just doesn't have that. He's kind of got that orangey nape color there that blends in with the rest of the head. The shapes of these beaks, most sparrow beaks, in fact, are actually going to be very similarly shaped. Their beaks are shaped in such a way that is indicative of what they're eating most of the time. And so a lot of these sparrows are really just eating whatever they can catch. They're eating lots of insects, they're eating lots of seeds, and they're pretty much all over the place when it comes to their food sources. So they're not super picky. Nelson sparrow looks like a meadowlark. I would say, yeah, I can see that for sure. Just size wise, this guy isn't going to be anywhere near that. A meadowlark's going to be 3 or 4 times the size of a Nelson sparrow. They're quite diminutive in general. Most of the sparrows are. And as I was saying before, too, the Nelson sparrow, you're not really ever going to see one unless you really are trying and you know where one's nesting and it lets you get close to it. And then you just wait and it pops up out of the grass. Whereas a meadowlark, they're singing all day long. You can hear them from miles away in some cases if you've got a nice clear day. So that's going to be your one indicator there that's going to rule that out for you. Anything else about these four? Or any questions on these guys?
Yeah, I love hearing about how their behaviors and their physical features are, so so related as they should be, but with the beaks or the bills or the mandibles, um, when you're beginning, you don't really realize that if you're eating a lot of seeds, you're going to be needing this shape. And if you're eating a lot of insects, you're going to have this shape. And if you're eating both, then it's going to be a bit different too. And I remember Dr. Lovell showing me on one of the birds that we picked up downtown, they almost have some whiskers right by their bill. Do they all have that, or is it just certain species that have those little whiskery feathers?
Many species do, but mostly the benefit to birds having that is going to be, it's actually a really nice transition to our flycatchers.
Oh.
So actually, if you look at our eastern phoebe in the bottom right corner here, you can actually see those little whiskers coming out of the top. And so those are meant to be a detection of prey. So all of these birds, all of the flycatchers are aerial insectivores. There's some that will glean or pick insects off of branches or leaves, but mostly they'll be flying into the air, catching stuff out of the air. And those little whiskers can actually help them isolate where their prey actually is, so they can adjust their head position to actually grab their food. Western wood pewee, you can kind of see them a little bit there as well. But when you have them in hand, they really do stand out. Some of them are really quite long. So these four species, these are ones that you can identify fairly well without having heard them or seen them sing. Olive-sided flycatchers, they're really distinctly darkly colored. A nice white throat, nice white belly and breast. But those flanks are dark gray, almost black. Western wood pewee is kind of like a faded out olive-sided flycatcher. Very similar sort of, they all perch mostly upright, but this guy's got a little bit more faded vest color. And the breast isn't really as white as it is on the olive-sided. It's actually more of that grayish or brownish color, but you still get the white belly. One of the things about the Western wood pewee that's nice is that it actually does have an orange bottom portion of the bill or lower mandible and a gray upper mandible. And then it's got a little bit of a crest to the head. They're a pretty easy flycatcher to identify that way if you're just looking at them. Hammond's flycatcher, I picked this photo because it actually shows off exactly the features that you would look for. You see a nice clean delineation in the head and the body feathers. It's like a gray sort of blocky sort of shape. And then it transitions into like a greenish or yellowish green on the back. But that really nice clean transition from the gray head to a much more colorful pattern below that is a nice one for Hammond's flycatcher. We don't really get them a lot except on migration in southern Alberta, but if you were to go into the mountains, there's a few really good spots to hear them and see them. And they, again, hearing them sing, that's your home run for these guys. They all sing completely differently, makes them really easy to identify. Something I strongly recommend if you are interested in identifying birds and you are capable of hearing, then learning them by song is 100% 100% a home run every single time. Eastern phoebe, this guy doesn't really show off what makes him distinguishable in this photo, except for the fact that he has no wing bars, no coloring at all. This guy, 1, 2 wing bars here. So you can sort of see 1, 2 wing bars there. But if you were to see this guy from the front, it'd be nice, clean, plain white. Habitat, these guys are usually by wetlands or water bodies. They're usually nesting sort of under bridges or under human structures. But again, this guy's mostly black, whereas most of the other flycatchers are kind of a grayish or yellowish gray or greenish gray color on their body plumage, as you can see with the Hammond's flycatcher, or the Western wood pewes are more brown. These are the ones that get really tricky. The least flycatcher, one of the nice things for them is they've got nice thick wing bars, but they also have a white eye ring. But that white eye ring is variable. So it can be as bold as it is on this guy, or you get least flycatchers that are really faint like this. And the only reason I know that this is a least and this isn't a least, just based on the photos, is because this one I heard sing and this one I heard sing, and their songs were distinctive to their species. I identified this one here as an alder/willow flycatcher because without that song, you really can't tell anything about these guys, even if you have them in the hand. Like if you've caught them in a mist net and you're looking at the bird, even bird banders will just call it a trails flycatcher, which is the name of the species before it was split into alder and willow. Habitat wise, and in like which parts of the province they're in, that can be a nice indicator. If you just see a bird, say down in Medicine Hat, it's almost certainly going to be an alder flycatcher. Whereas if you see one into the Rockies or even into BC, it's probably going to be a willow because they're more a high elevation breeder. But on migration, they all have to come through the main flyways anyway. So it's really tough. If we ever had a window strike, a mortality of this species or either of these two species, there's no way we would be able to tell it. One of the things that people like to use is what's called primary projection. So if you can see this guy's primaries, this is the bird's secondary feathers here. And then you measure this distance from the tip of the secondaries to the end of the primaries, and it gives you a value. Alder flycatchers have a longer primary projection than a willow flycatcher, but there is overlap. So at the extremes, you can say this was definitely an alder or this was definitely a willow. But if you're right in the middle, you still have to call it alder/willow or trails flycatcher. Pacific slope, I think you can probably tell this guy's kind of yellowish green all over. That's exactly what this guy's going to be. He's yellowish green all over. He has a little bit of a teardrop eye ring. But again, a mountain bird, you're mostly going to find it near water bodies, wetlands, streams, creeks, that sort of thing. But that really bright yellow color overall is a really good indicator for them. And it's what makes them stand out from all of the other flycatchers. And then lastly, you have your dusky flycatcher. And one thing that really stands out with these guys compared to everything else is just how long that tail is. It's almost the exact same length as the rest of the body. Like if you were to measure from here to here, it's just about exactly equal to what the distance is from the nose or the tip of the bill to that those undertail coverts. But it has sort of broken up wing bars, not really distinct. It's kind of a bit blotchy everywhere else. They're not super distinct in terms of their patterning. But again, this is a bird you're going to find in the mountains, very specific habitats, and you're going to hear it sing long before you see it. So I got a couple more slides about warblers. We talked about these in the fall. Tennessee warblers in the spring are really distinct. But with warblers, a couple of things that you can look for that helps you narrow things down are things like eye rings, head color, bill shape. So this guy, orange crown warbler versus Tennessee warbler, these are some of the two that are actually probably the hardest in the warblers to tell apart. That Tennessee warbler has a slightly more rounded bill at the top, whereas the orange crown is super, super thin and pointy, like dagger-like, almost like a pine siskin would be. And that's because this guy is typically eating smaller insects and spending more time gleaning from inside of flowers or things like that, where it's more important for him to get the bill into a spot. Whereas the Tennessee warbler is going to be eating things like caterpillars. It's going to be eating things that are just sort of sitting out in the open. And maybe, with that thicker bill, something with like maybe a stronger exoskeleton or slightly denser exoskeletons, so ants or beetles or things like that. And then you've got your yellow warbler, which has a complete circular eye ring and is yellow overall, yellow head, sort of olive colored back, and then it has black colored primary feathers. This guy doesn't have those black primary feathers. It's kind of a gradation of that greenish color that goes down into those. And then this guy's primary feathers are exactly the same color as his secondary coverts. So that's all the same color. So if it's got black primaries and a white eye ring, maybe it's a yellow warbler. It's another good feature. But if you were looking at just the bill, you really couldn't tell the yellow warbler from the Tennessee because it's a very similar shaped bill between those two. So ultimately, if you were to look at a lot of these different birds and think about trying to key them out, each of these major groups, you could probably key out by, does it have white supercilium? Does it have a gray nape? Does it have a pointy bill or a rounded bill? Does it have a yellow rump? Does it have streaks on the side or not? Does it have a plain belly? Does it have a central breast spot? Does it have wing bars? And each of those would take you down a different road of sort of figuring it out internally what exactly you've got. But even still, many of these birds can take a really long time to sort out when you get into the much more challenging ones, especially in fall when you're not hearing them sing.
So Dan, if you're a beginner birder and you want to be passed off as like a pretty expert birder, would it be safe to say you just want to start complaining about fall warblers? Just like, oh, this fall warblers, oh, I know,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
that'd
then just
be
change the topic and they'll be like, wow, they really know their stuff.
exactly. um, so the Cape May warblers, one we get through here. The reason I tied these two together and then wanted to talk about this guy a little bit as well is, again, you have that streaky sort of patterning on the flanks, maybe a little bit down into the belly. You've got wing bars on this guy, no wing bars on this guy, but this is a juvenile, so it's got a little bit of gray. So if this was a little bit younger, you'd probably have these gray downy feathers all the way up into the throat. And if you say we're missing the head on this guy, it'd be a really hard bird to identify because there's nothing super distinctive about it. And it might be mistaken for, say, a yellow rump warbler, or in another case, you could even maybe make the mistake of calling it an orange crowned or a Tennessee, just because you don't really have a lot of context. But head color and head shape and bill shape and like all of those facial features are really important for identifying this guy. Yellow rump warbler, not showing off the yellow rump. So how else do you identify it? Well, this nice bright yellow flank, it's another good indicator. If you don't have the head, you don't have the rump, just have the body somehow, or just a wing, can be easily identified just by one or two little things here. And then you've got bay-breasted and blackpoll warblers in the fall. They both look like this in the fall, and in the spring they look nothing like this. These are super challenging. Comes down to these wing bars, how thick they are or how thin they are, the color of the bottoms of the feet, and the thickness of the bill. And this one here, I'm going to show you. This one here is a bay-breasted warbler in the fall. And I want you to compare it to.
Oh, Dan, are you showing us a different one from your PowerPoint?
I am going to show you a different one
You're going to? Okay.
I'm just going to share. I just had to get it opened up here.
Oh yeah, no problem. No problem. I heard clicking and I'm like, uh-oh, it didn't change. Just thought I'd ask.
So you then also have this blackpoll warbler, which has those wing bars, but it has yellow feet, whereas our bay-breasted actually had black feet. And I'll go back to that guy in a second. And it's a really thin, sort of narrow, almost like an orange crown warbler sort of bill. But otherwise, this is a tough bird. Like even expert birders get this wrong probably half the time. So we'll go back. That foot color is actually your one key identifying feature. Because if you look at the feet, those are black. And how often do you get a bird that you can identify just by the foot color compared to the rest of it? It's not that easy. And you often don't even see the bottoms of the feet either. It just happens to be that I lucked out and managed to get that guy in the right pose.
Wow, no kidding.
So the last couple points here, I will answer your question about learning birdsong in just a second here. So for using photography for identification, I'll talk about two different things. First of all, we'll talk about a live bird versus a bird in the hand that's either been captured at a banding station or is a window stripe that is deceased. So you're going to try.
Are you guys hearing Dan okay? Or is it just me? Oh, no, no audio. Dan, do you want to just check your microphone? Oh, I think I hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. My speakers or my microphone headset just died.
Aw, well, we can hear you now, so thank you. Except now. I hear you clicking, but if you're speaking.
Can you guys hear me?
Okay, we can hear clicking, but we didn't hear speaking for the last little while. And if you need a minute, that's totally okay. Just want to make sure we're not missing.
So my headset just died. So if you hear me now, that's fine. I'm just going to be going over to my laptop speakers and microphone. So.
Okay, yeah, you just cut out a little bit. I don't know if the microphone that you have when you're close to it sounds good. And then, but yeah, if you need a second to get reset, you let us know. It's no problem.
Okay, yeah, give me 1 second here.
Yeah, you bet. So a lot of the time when we're downtown in Calgary and we're looking for the different window strikes, as Dan was saying, we'll find different birds at the bottom of the buildings. And we try to get a few photos at that point because it does help us to get an immediate or a nearly immediate identification if we're able to. And then also just for learning later as to, going back and seeing sort of what the situation was about, like the proximity of the bird to the building, whereabouts in the building, did it strike? We can get a lot of different information from the photographs. And so a lot of us are learning more too about how to photograph the birds in such a way that they can be identified by someone like Dan or Bob. Because when you're a beginner, like I am, when I see a bird that's unusual to me, it looks to me like it should be completely obvious to an expert that, well, this is really a strange looking bird. It must be quite easy to identify, but then it turns out that no, that's not necessarily the case. And so getting those shots, the back and the head and everything that Dan's going to describe, that's where that becomes important too. And so depending upon your own hobbies or things you might come upon, these would be great tips for, trying to identify birds that you see in different situations.
All right, can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's okay. Perfect.
Great. Yeah, so as Kathleen was saying, we always are trying to get the best photos that will show off enough features so that we can identify it. And if, more photos is always better, but it's not always easy to get a lot of photos, especially if you have a live bird that's not really going to be super cooperative in getting photos. So if you're able to at least get a shot of the head or a shot of the wing or a front-on shot of sort of the belly or breast view, that's usually going to tell you enough. With maybe with just the one, but with at least two, you can probably narrow it down to a couple of things. That doesn't even necessarily have to be in focus, but it is going to tell you sort of the general features that you're looking at that can help someone who is sort of more on the expert side to narrow down to maybe a couple of species. But if you're able to get all of them, usually you can get a pretty solid ID most of the time. If you're able to get different angles of a bird without obstructions, so again, talking about a live bird here, it's going to be moving around. If you've got half the bird covered by a leaf, it's not going to be the greatest thing. But if you've got something like a yellow-rumped warbler and you can see that bright yellow rump in the shot, it's gonna stick in your head as something different about that bird that made you pay attention to it. And that's, I think, ultimately, when you are not sure what a bird is, try to figure that out for yourself about what it was that made you realize that that was something different in terms of how it looked versus how it sounded. And then the other thing is trying to capture the true color of the bird. So in the fall or in the summer, a lot of times you will get some color distortion from the foliage. So you'll get a kind of a greenish cast or a greenish hue on a lot of birds. As long as you're telling the person that it was shot underneath the canopy, and so it might look a little bit more greenish than it actually was, that can be a good thing. It helps them sort of figure out what the true color actually was. But if you get it out in like nice bright sunlight or overcast would actually be better. It doesn't wash out those features in that greenish wash, or if it's out in the like complete bright sunlight, you might have all the colors completely washed out and it might just look like a white and black bird in that case, whereas you lose some of that distinction and those more subtle features in the gradation of colors. It's a tough thing to really sort of sort out in the field, but when you have a bird in hand, that's actually quite a bit easier, and you can actually look at the bird in a bunch of different angles. So if you have the bird in hand, a lot of times if we're doing it before sunrise, you will only have your camera's flashlight. One of the things that we found was really useful is if you have your flashlight on, but not pointed directly on the bird, and you're just getting sort of that secondary glow from the flashlight, that's actually way better for getting what the actual coloring and patterning of the bird is, because if you have your flashlight right on the bird, your camera is just going to get completely washed out colors again. So it doesn't help you a ton with that either. But you can pose it as long as you're comfortable with doing so. You can pose it so that you're getting that breast and belly shot of the front of the bird. You can turn it onto its stomach and get a shot of the wings. You can even spread the wing out if it's not completely stiff yet. And then you can get a shot of the head or the face from either the front on or side on angle, so that again, you can, whoever is looking at the bird back home, or you might even be able to figure out yourself in the field once you get a good look at all of those things, to say, oh, well, this is this sparrow versus that sparrow. But sometimes, even when you have a bird in hand, you just don't have enough of it left. If it's been partially predated, or it's just not in great shape, or it's bloody, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes you just have to go with, it's a sparrow and we'll figure it out later. And so you just collect the bird and move on. But identifying live birds is definitely a lot more challenging because they're not quite as cooperative as the ones that you can have in the hand to work with and move around as you see fit. I think that actually does wrap up slides. But I was going to talk about how to learn bird songs besides seeing and hearing the birds in the field. There are a bunch of different great resources for that. I'm going to just post a link in the chat here that I think is probably our best source of that. The website is called Dendroica. It is free. It is put together by Bird Studies, I guess formerly Bird Studies Canada, now Birds Canada. also by Environment and Climate Change Canada in partnership with USGS and one of the universities in Mexico. I don't speak Spanish, so I don't know what this actually means, but it is called Dendroica, and the link to it is going in the chat right now.
And for anybody who's joining, you won't be able to copy and paste that link. So I would suggest clicking on it while the meeting's still active, opening it in your browser, and then you can save it from there.
And for anyone who's just listening in and isn't reading the chat, it is natureinstruct.org is the name of the website. If you were to Google Dendroica, Dendroica, you can follow that through, and it actually helps you identify essentially anything that's found in the Western Hemisphere. You can quiz yourself on what birds you're seeing or hearing, and it will show you, you have different options for the level of difficulty. You can change it to just looking for birds in Canada or Mexico or Central America or the Caribbean. You can, during the quizzes, you can say, I only want to look at birds that are waterfowl or duck. And so it will show you just pictures, or it can also play songs without a picture. Or if you want to get like really expert at it, you can actually look at what's called a spectrogram, which is a visual representation of what the sound sounds like. So if you're a non-hearing person, that can actually be a really good way. And if you're looking at the spectrograms, I'll just share it here to show you what that looks like.
Oh, are you showing us that screen just because just in case your PowerPoint is up? Just in case.
I am sharing it now.
No rush. Just
yeah.
Just want to let you know.
Can you see it now?
Yeah. Are you able to zoom in a little bit?
I can.
American Widgeon. Okay.
So
were you playing
American
that a
Widgeon.
moment ago? Because I thought I heard something.
I was playing that, yes.
You were? Okay.
Like when you load it up. But if you look at, this is a spectrogram. This is what it sounds like. And so that visual representation for all of those songs is unique to each species. So if you're a non-hearing person, you can look at that and say, that's what American Widgeon call looks like.
Wow.
You wanted to just look at the photos and hear the sound during the quiz, you're going to hear that, and you're going to see the photo of the widgeon, and it's going to tie that in your head, those two sound, the sound and the image together, to reinforce what that bird actually is in terms of the identification of it. So you can go through, I think I've got it set to North America, or no, Canada, and there's 254 species that it lists, but there's way more than that too. So you get things like common nighthawks, sound like that.
Do we have those here?
We do, yeah.
Okay, because that's really cool.
And again, spectrogram.
Isn't that something? So for a non-hearing person,
yeah,
if say you were outside on a nature walk and you did some video or audio taping and then played it back, is there a means to see what you've recorded and be able to compare it visually to, I guess they'd probably have to have some software or something to be able to download what they have.
There are apps that you can basically, you import your audio file or your video file into it, and it will give you a spectrogram of what is being seen or heard. It's really ideal if you get a nice clean recording of it without other birds singing in the background, or without, the sound of breaking twigs or the sound of walking through leaves or something like that. If you get a nice clean recording, it'll show up really, really smoothly.
Okay. Wow.
But apps that you can do on your phone. There's also Xenocanto, Xeno, canto is another website that is good for looking just at spectrograms or hearing those bird songs or those bird calls out of context. It's entirely user supported. So another citizen science project. Or if you are uploading a list to eBird and you upload your audio to your list, it will convert that to a spectrogram as well when you go back to look at that song later on. So
Oh, wow.
different options for it. I find that the eBird option is probably the most accessible as long as you're using eBird and are already set up. Merlin also does that. And I was going to talk about that here in a sec too. So Merlin now built into it, it's an app that you can use to identify birds that you're seeing in an area, but there's a portion of it where you can record a song and it will tell you what bird is singing that song. And from what I've seen so far this summer, I tried it out on a bunch of different species and it's very reliable at just identifying what you're hearing right inside the app. You just have to have a data connection so it can send that recording to the server and then run it through its own algorithms and then spit it back out and say, hey, this is what I think that species was. So that's another. It doesn't help you necessarily learn the song right away. It's more, I'm not sure what that is. It's different. Let's learn it. I personally find things like Dendroica, things where you're quizzing yourself without the answer immediately given to you, or you're going through a bunch of different things. Just that familiarity is probably the best way for me that helps me learn what a new bird song is. Is more accurate than eBird? I would say, because they're basically both using the same, I don't think eBird is really good for identifying stuff you don't know. Merlin is I think that the sole purpose of Merlin is to help you identify stuff, either whether it's you're uploading a photo of a bird you've seen or a description of a bird you've seen, or recording the song and having it submit to their servers. I think that's better than putting it on eBird and saying you don't know what the species is or that you don't know what the song is and hoping that you get a response. The other way is a little bit more AI guided, and it does give you really good, really accurate identifications.
Wow. And I know on iNaturalist, there is now a method to be able to, you can click on share an observation, and right then you can record audio. So say you're in your backyard, you happen to have your iPhone with you, and which I didn't the other day with the bird that was on top of the tree that I heard and cannot identify. Yeah, so if I did have my phone with me, I could have used iNaturalist too to audio record it. But when I'm listening to those, sometimes I'm finding they're a little bit faint and not necessarily hearing it as clearly. But do you use iNaturalist too, Dan, for your observations? We had a talk from Matt last week on iNaturalist.
I typically will use my non-bird sightings. I use iNaturalist for my non-bird sightings and then eBird for my bird sightings. It's most of the time I'm not really looking for an identification of a bird or anything like that. And I find that sometimes even if I know what the bird is and I submit it to iNaturalist, I will get pushback and people will say it's something that it clearly isn't. So I don't tend to use it for birds as much, but otherwise I think it's a good resource for a lot of different things, and for sound recordings and stuff like that too would be great, or for features. So like if you found a nest cavity for like a pileated or a feeding cavity of a pileated woodpecker, for instance, and wanted to record that'd be a good use for iNaturalist versus eBird, which doesn't care about looking at those sort of secondary features or those habitat features and just whether you saw the bird or not.
Right.
Then Laura's got a question about Merlin versus BirdNet. I believe they actually use the same algorithms. So I think I've only used BirdNet and I found it really accurate. I used Merlin a little bit on my work phone and found it equally accurate, but BirdNet, I'm pretty sure they use the same algorithms. So they use the same technology to do those identifications in the field.
Wow. We've got just a few minutes left, and so it's put a call out for any questions. Bob sent me a note regarding the bird that I don't know if you saw my notes earlier in the chat, Dan, but I did hear a bird the other day. I just went outside really quickly during a quick break, and it almost sounded like a robin singing in spring. And I scurried around a little bit to try to spot it, and it was not too far away at the very top of a pine tree, and it was a lighter colored bird, not a robin, but lighter colored. Bob threw out, what was the bird that Bob thought maybe should know this, because we have found one on our Townsend Solitaire maybe. Yeah, I'll have to look up that, see what that sounds like. Close. It was definitely bigger than a pine grosbeak, though I feel like it was. So now is the part when we're going to get you to identify each of the birds that we've seen in our past, if that's okay. Oh, solitaires are smaller. It's a mystery. But the pine grosbeak sound a little bit.
Anything that would sound, I would say anything that would sound like a robin this time of year. I think the only things that really sound very similar are pine grosbeaks, and yeah, I guess maybe Townsend solitaires. But
thank you. And while you're looking that up too, do you still lead bird watching walks at Fish Creek?
I am sort of not currently, but I think for the winter session from like January through March, I'll be signed up as a backup leader.
Okay. Perfect.
It's something I was doing pretty consistently, but yeah, it's hard to sort of schedule it in with my work schedule right now to that consistent volunteer effort out there.
Yeah, we have Friends of Fish Creek. I think is that who that's through?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that's good.
They've got a ton of really great leaders, and most of the leaders that are leading now actually have come up as just participants in the course, and they're pretty great. I mean, obviously, from some really great people, both myself and tons of others.
That's terrific. Oh, well, thank you. Does anybody else have any more questions before we start to conclude? No, hey. I'm sure you've got us all thinking, Dan. That was really, really interesting. The only other question I had burning in my mind is when you have the white bars on the wing. Is the white from a marking on the actual feather, or are those two feathers that are overlapping? One's white and one is a colored feather, or could it be either?
Those wing bars essentially are a part of the actual feather itself. They're basically just the very tip of it that is slightly different colors. So
okay,
had
so like
yes.
I know it's getting late too. I forgot to mention to the group too. We do have one of the birds that we found downtown, as well as some feathers from a find the other day too. So if anybody would like to stay on and see those, I'd be happy to bring them out, and we can test your skills. So that's one of the feathers. Do you know what this is, Dan?
I can't see it too well. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here. So it's dark and then has a white patch and then goes dark again.
It's actually yellow or kind of a buff color.
And how long is that?
Like finger length. It would be. Do I have a ruler handy? Oh, of course I don't. I'm gonna say 2.5 inches long, perhaps.
I was gonna guess that it might have been a tungsten solitaire, but that's not right either, because I think that might,
It's
no, it might be the primary feather, one of the longer ones.
it's quite difficult to actually, because Dave and Ellen and a few of us that were trying to figure it out. And it turned out that the photos that I had taken of these feathers against the backing, when you mentioned the color, it was washing out the color. And
Mm.
Dr. Scobie from the Royal Alberta Museum uh, happened to notice this feather, and he's like, "Oh, you have an American redstart feather there as well."
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I can
So,
see that.
and then when he said that, and then I looked at it, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah." Does that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Tricky though, because I scoured the books, could not. But yeah, the colors are very tricky on that. And I'm just wondering if anybody who's curious, we'll see if anybody's able to if there's any observations on this, Dan, that you could share.
Well, I was going to say you using that, you actually kind of answer your own question about the wing bars because you have a terminal
Ah,
tail band, right? And that's the exact same thing as you would have at the tips of the secondaries or the coverts that would form a wing bar. So it really is just the very tips of the feathers being that white color.
I did. You're right. Okay. And this is actually the tail of a sharp-shinned hawk. I should mention to everybody too. A lot of the folks are volunteers with our group, so you already know this, but just in case, the work that we do is under wildlife permits through the province and through the federal government. And we've been very fortunate to have Dr. Lovell at St. Mary's University having us on as a group on his permits up until now, which has been wonderful. And so we're just shifting our permits over now onto our own, and so it's quite interesting process and in and of itself. But just want to mention that if you do find a bird or find feathers or anything, just to be aware that you can't, keep feathers or anything like that because there's a few details on that, but better to leave it there because they're almost always protected by law. So the reason that we have them here, and that's why I want to mention to you, is these are all collected under our program and held under the federal and provincial permits. And so anything that happens with them, if we transfer them to the university or to a school, then we end up having to, we track where everything goes and all of that as well. So just wanted to let you know that too. Would you like to see the whole bird that was out the other day?
Yes.
Okay. And before I put this one away too there. This was part of the same bird too. And you were saying these feathers are used for steering and on the wing?
Yeah, that's the alula.
The alula.
Feathers of the alula, and
The alula, Bob. Good job.
yeah, so they're basically like the wing flaps of the plane. So when they raise them or lower them rapidly, it can cause the bird to either be able to climb straight up or just drop straight down.
Okay. Oh,
Obviously,
excellent.
with that species, it's going to be super important for it to have the ability to navigate and change direction very, very quickly.
Oh, and they're really maneuverable, are they? Bob just pointed
Absolutely.
out too. I don't know a lot about them actually. I'm just muting so I can save you from the paper noises. But when we do collect the birds from downtown, if they've passed away, we try to treat them always as respectfully as possible and, with great care. And then we store them in the cold. So I've got a cold pack here with these. So this one is quite an interesting species actually. So let me know if my camera aiming. Dan and I, due to COVID, we had quite a long cyber identification session where you had to be very patient, saying to me, could you aim it a little to the left? Could I just see a little? Anybody has a guess as to the species or any observations on it? This one was found just last weekend. So Carla said the gray-crowned rosy finch. Dan, Bob, what do you think?
That would be correct.
It is. Now, this would be an unusual bird, though, to find generally. Like, I guess there's been some sightings in Calgary and Airdrie, I think, recently, but I don't know if.
Yeah, we usually see them sort of in the fall, I would say regularly-ish in Calgary and Cochrane area, but and I guess up to Airdrie, but some years we'll get flocks of, up to 1,000 of them in the city, and everyone on the west end of the city will have them at their bird feeders for a day or two. If there's a huge snowfall in the mountains, but it stays barren in Calgary and out more towards the prairies, but they're mostly a high elevation bird year round.
Right. And I guess like the tail shape too is, I guess sometimes the one of the details. Bob just asked, in a downtown window strike. Yeah, it was. In fact, what's strange I find is that we found that species over 2 different years at almost the same time of year. I'm going to have to look up. The first one we found was in fall of 2019 during our first year of surveys. It's one of our very, very last visits downtown. In fact, I'm going to say it was probably like November 2nd or so. Because I think I went out a couple more times just after the surveys ended just to see if things were really clearing up, and found one at the bottom of the building in hole, and then found this one just the other day, and I'm pretty sure it was the same building. Usually I remember exactly where. 99% sure it was the exact same building too, which is very strange. Carla said there's one at the Alberta Institute for Wildlife Conservation right now in their care from a blunt trauma of some kind. And that's where we really need everybody to mark their windows, because I don't know, just if we could just avoid this, and learning about them the more challenging way when they're alive up in the trees is far more preferred. It's quite an honor to be able to be this close to them though, and to see them so close and to learn from them. We're really grateful for that. But yeah, thanks for sharing that, Carla. We'll have to look into that. Definitely. I'm not sure. Melanie is actually on in the crowd as well. And she's our other co-founder with Calgary Migratory Species Response Team. She's the director of animal care at Calgary Wildlife. So it's so nice that you're here too, Melanie. And yeah, I'm not sure if you've had that particular species come into Calgary Wildlife, but yeah, it sounds like it's quite an unusual one to have around, but it is getting late. I could ask you questions all evening, Dan, and everybody has been just a fantastic group here. Really grateful for all of you. We have one more session next week. Oh, and Mel said, yes, we've had 2 in 2 years. So they've had 2 live ones injured coming into them, and then we have found 2 deceased ones. So yeah, not super common, but yeah, and I'm going to just ask, first of all, I want to really thank Anne and Marissa, who are doing all the organization, the coordination with our speakers, finding those great speakers, coordinating everything, and setting everything up so we can all enjoy these times together. So thank you so much, Anne and Marissa. And Marissa will be sending out an information sheet to everybody who's here, summarizing the information that you heard tonight. So Dan, you can watch for that in your inbox if you don't mind giving it a little look over. And then because Marissa will just want to check with you to make sure she's captured everything, and she does an amazing job at it. And then it'll come into everybody's inboxes shortly after, which is terrific. And I think Marissa doesn't mind telling us about what's next week. And then we'll be taking a break on Wildlife Wednesdays through the winter. And then please watch for us again in we're not exactly sure the next dates, but we will definitely let you know when that is. And Carla, yes, we're recording these, and what we're going to be doing when it's a little bit quieter is we're going to put them onto YouTube. So we're going to work on that and get those on there. If you need the recording earlier, we can provide you with that. It's more of informal and won't be edited or anything, but we can certainly do that if you'd like. And Dan, thank you so much. Just so everybody knows, our speakers, we're not funded for these sessions, so they are brought to you entirely by volunteer time of Anne and Marissa and our speakers, and everything that we utilize to bring this to you and to all of us is donated. So within our group, and it's just so nice when you're here because your presence makes it so worth it. So Dan, thank you very, very much for your time. I think we'd love to have you back 1,000 more times. And Marissa, if I could just ask you to quickly touch on what is next week, and then folks will know to keep an eye out for Eventbrite in the next couple of days. Marissa and Anne have sent all the information to me. They're just waiting for me to have a minute to upload it to Eventbrite, and then you will get to sign up for that.
Yeah, so next week we have Birding in the Anthropocene with another member of our team and also a Calgary-based visual artist, Julia. And she'll be taking us on a behind-the-scenes tour of her newest project, which is actually a partnership with the Calgary Migratory Response Team to photograph in great detail the finds that we have found over the years.
Fantastic. Thank you, Marissa. And Julia actually did a beautiful job of scanning in the birds that we still had in our care from fall of 2020 and spring of 2021. And those were presented for the Global Bird Rescue. So some of you may have seen her images already, but the detail that they're in are such that she can actually have them printed at 6 feet tall and not lose any definition. So if you are interested in art, if you're interested in wildlife, if you're interested in the anatomy of birds and other other animals, and she does plants and fungi and all kinds of really neat things as well, I really encourage you to come and join and meet Julia and see some of these incredible images and learn more about that project as well. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Dan. Bravo.
Thank you for the invite. I did also want to mention, so I do annually have calendars for sale. Like Kathleen showed off one, the 2021 calendar. I do have those for sale now for 2022, and it's essentially just all my photos that most of them have been taken in the last calendar year, and they're species that we either have in Calgary or very close to Calgary entirely. And I'm charging $25 including shipping.
Including shipping?
Yes. So send me here or send a message, an email, and I will respond to that right away.
And we can find you on, where's the best place to find you? On social media with Twitter, if anybody wants to write you directly?
Yeah, Twitter or Instagram. I will put my
and you know what? We can also put it in the newsletter that Marissa is doing up. Oh, and there we go. Yeah, Ubermoogle on Twitter and on Instagram. That's perfect. Yeah, and the calendars are wonderful Christmas presents, and it's super easy because Dan mails them for you.
Exactly.
And I noticed you had a common raven was on the cover.
On the cover, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Are there some sparrows on the inside so we can practice our identification skills?
What is on other sparrows on the inside? I think I might have not sparrows. I know I did include thick-billed longspur, which is one of our species at risk here in Alberta.
Wow.
A couple owls. and mostly songbirds. But I don't think there's any sparrows this year.
Okay. Well, we can expand our knowledge now that we're experts at sparrows.
Exactly.
That's wonderful. I'll just stop the recording here.